After years apart, Dr. Emma Reed returns to the gorilla she raised, only to find him unpredictable and dangerous. Can the bond they once shared be restored, or will it be lost forever? And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Watch as an emotional reunion unfolds with an unexpected twist. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sun was setting low over the dense jungle, casting long shadows across the wildlife reserve. The air was thick with humidity, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at the presence of unseen creatures. Dr. Emma Reed stood at the edge of the large, heavily secured gate, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't been here in 5 years, 5 long years since she last laid eyes on Kazi, the silverback gorilla she had raised from infancy. The wind shifted, brushing the damp strands of hair away from her face. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the nerves that had already begun to fray at the edges. The reserve was a place she had once called home, where she had worked tirelessly alongside her team to ensure the safety and rehabilitation of endangered species. But Kazi, the gorilla she had grown so close to, was not like the others. He was more than just a research subject. He had been her companion, her friend. Now, she wasn't so sure of what he had become. Emma had been warned repeatedly, by her colleagues, by the staff at the reserve, not to meet Kazi again. His behavior had changed over the years. The gorilla that once trusted her, followed her every move, and responded to her calm voice with affection, had become unpredictable. Violent, even. There had been reports of his erratic behavior, attacks on the keepers, and overall aggression that no one had expected. And yet, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something within Kazi that remembered her. Despite all the warnings, despite the fears that had crept into her thoughts, Emma couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. There had been so many unanswered questions over the years. What had happened to Kazi after she left? Why had he become this way? Was it because of her absence? She had to know. She had to see him, even if it was just one last time. With shaking hands, Emma unlocked the gate, the rusted metal creaking as it opened slowly. The weight of the decision felt heavier now, the reality of it settling in. As she stepped into the enclosure, the overwhelming sense of nostalgia hit her. She had spent countless hours here, watching Kazi grow from a helpless, orphaned baby gorilla into the majestic, towering creature he was today. The jungle had always been full of life, but it felt different now, quieter, more foreboding. The path leading deeper into the enclosure was lined with tall trees, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. Emma's boots crunched softly against the dirt as she moved forward, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. She knew Kazi would be close by. He always had been. But now, in the quiet, there was only the hum of the jungle and the sense of something watching her. Something waiting. "Come on, Kazi," she whispered under her breath, her voice trembling slightly. "It's me." Her voice barely carried, swallowed by the thick air, but she knew Kazi's keen ears would pick it up. There was a faint rustling in the bushes nearby, and Emma froze. Her heart rate quickened. She wasn't sure what to expect. Would he come charging at her in a fit of rage, like the reports had described? Or would he remember her, the woman who had been there for him during the most vulnerable time of his life? Another rustle. A shadow flickered through the dense trees. Emma's breath hitched. There he was. She saw the massive form of Kazi in the distance, standing tall and imposing at the edge of the clearing. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The world around them disappeared, and all Emma could focus on was the gorilla's gaze, so familiar, so intense. He was just standing there, watching her, his expression unreadable. The last time she had seen him, he had been smaller, more innocent. Now, the weight of his size and strength was apparent, even from a distance. Kazi's muscles rippled beneath his fur as he slowly moved forward, his large hands brushing against the foliage. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she realized that this was real. He was really here, and he was coming toward her. She took a cautious step forward, her palms sweating. "Kazi, it's me." Emma. The name felt strange now, foreign almost, but as soon as the words left her lips, Kazi's eyes seemed to soften just a fraction. Emma knew it was a small sign, but it was enough to give her hope. She took another step toward him, her feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. She didn't want to rush him. She didn't want to scare him. But Kazi was still watching her, his massive form unmoving. Emma stopped just a few feet away from him, standing still, trying to keep her movements slow and controlled. She extended her hand, palm open, as she had done so many times before when he was a baby, when he had reached up to touch her with the innocence of a child who trusted her completely. "Kazi, please, you remember me, don't you?" For a moment, it seemed like he might respond. His chest rose and fell slowly with each breath, and Emma could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. She felt her pulse quicken. Was this the moment? Would he remember her like she had remembered him? But then, without warning, Kazi growled. It wasn't a low, inquisitive sound like before. No, this time it was a deep, threatening growl, reverberating through the air. Emma froze, her hand still extended. Kazi's body tensed, his posture shifting from curiosity to something far more primal, far more dangerous. The moment of recognition was fleeting. "Kazi," she whispered, her voice shaking now, though she tried to remain calm. "It's me. Emma. You know me." Her words hung in the air, but Kazi did not respond. Instead, he took another step forward, his large frame blocking out the sky. His eyes never left hers, but his expression was a mix of confusion and aggression. He was unsure of her, of what she meant to him. Emma's heart twisted in her chest. She had hoped for more, but she had to accept that Kazi wasn't the same. He wasn't the baby she had raised. The gorilla's chest heaved with each breath, his lips pulling back slightly, showing his massive teeth. He let out another growl, louder this time, and Emma instinctively took a step back. Fear started to creep in, but she fought it down. She couldn't show fear, not in front of him. Not in front of the animal she had once taken care of. "Kazi, please," Emma said again, her voice a little more desperate this time. "Please, I'm here. I'm not a threat." But Kazi was still moving forward. Emma took another step back, but this time, she felt the ground beneath her feet begin to give way slightly. The path she had walked on had become soft, and the sudden shift in the terrain threw her off balance. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and she fell forward. Kazi's eyes flashed with something else now. He saw her vulnerability, the sudden shift in her stance. He had always been protective of her when she was there to care for him, but now, with everything different, there was no way to tell how he would react. He was huge. Powerful. And the growl that escaped his throat now was terrifying. Emma scrambled to get back on her feet, panic rising within her. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. She took a deep breath, pushing herself up and slowly standing, all the while keeping her eyes fixed on Kazi. She couldn't afford to turn her back on him. Not with him this close. "Kazi, please," she said once more, her voice trembling with emotion. "I raised you. I'm here to help you. Please, trust me." For a moment, Kazi stopped. He stood still, his massive chest rising and falling, his eyes locked onto hers. There was something in them, a flicker of recognition, a hint of hesitation, but Emma wasn't sure if it was enough to reach him. Could she really get through to him? Or had the wildness within him overtaken everything they once shared? Kazi shifted again, his muscles rippling beneath his thick fur. He wasn't sure. Emma wasn't sure either. But in that moment, both of them stood in silence, the jungle holding its breath. Would he remember her? Or was this the end of their connection, the end of everything they had once been to each other? The answer, Emma realized, wasn't clear. Not yet. The enclosure stood quiet, save for the rustling of the jungle leaves in the breeze. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she carefully stepped through the gate, the heavy steel door creaking slightly as it swung open. Her fingers brushed the rough metal of the gate before she locked it behind her. This was it, the moment she had been dreading and anticipating for years. Inside the enclosure, Kazi was there, somewhere in the shadows, watching her. His presence was unmistakable. Even though she couldn't see him yet, she could feel his eyes on her. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she moved forward. The scent of the jungle surrounding her mingled with the faint, earthy smell of the gorilla's territory. She called his name softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Kazi, it's me, Emma." For a moment, there was only silence. Emma stood still, trying to calm the fluttering in her chest. She could see nothing but the towering trees and thick underbrush around her, but the weight of his gaze was undeniable. She remembered the times when she and Kazi would play together in this very enclosure, when he was a tiny infant who would clumsily try to climb trees and chase after her. It seemed like a lifetime ago. "Come on, Kazi," she whispered again, this time more urgently. "You know me." And then, just like that, he appeared. Kazi's hulking form stepped into the clearing. He was massive now, his silver fur gleaming in the dim light, and his deep brown eyes locked onto hers. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. But something was different. His gaze wasn't the familiar warmth she remembered, it was colder, harder. He stood motionless, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths as if he was trying to decide whether to approach or retreat. Emma's heart sank. This wasn't the same gentle giant she had raised from infancy. This was a grown gorilla, his own mind, his own fears, his own experiences. Emma knew it was foolish to expect the same trust that existed between them all those years ago. "Kazi," she whispered again, barely able to keep her voice from trembling. He made no move toward her. Instead, he simply watched, his eyes never leaving hers, but now there was something darker in them, something that felt foreign to Emma. She had always been his protector, the one who cared for him when he was sick or scared, the one who comforted him after the storms. But now, she wasn't sure if she was still that person to him. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick. Emma stood, frozen, trying to gauge what Kazi was thinking. She wasn't foolish enough to approach him too quickly, not after all the warnings she had received. She had heard the rumors, the stories from her colleagues. Kazi had grown more unpredictable over the years. He had started to show signs of aggression, even toward the staff who had taken care of him. They said it was a phase, a natural part of his development, but Emma feared it was more than that. "Kazi," she said again, taking a cautious step forward. His eyes flickered to her hand, the one she extended toward him. The old gesture. But there was no recognition, not like the warm, trusting moments they had shared before. No hesitation. No familiar affection. His expression remained unreadable. Emma could see the muscles in his arms twitching, ready to spring into action if needed. And then, without warning, Kazi gave a low, guttural growl. The sound sent a chill down Emma's spine. It wasn't a warning growl, like when he was upset. No, this growl was deeper, more menacing. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She froze, unsure of what to do next. "Kazi," she said, her voice shaking slightly now. "It's me. It's Emma. Please, just..." Kazi took a step forward, his massive feet crushing the leaves beneath him. His eyes never left her as he approached, moving with a dangerous grace. Emma's instincts screamed at her to step back, but she held her ground. Kazi had always been sensitive to her movements. He could sense her fear, her hesitation. But she wasn't afraid of him, not like this. She knew Kazi. She knew how to calm him. Except, this time, there was something different in his movements. His body language was aggressive, defensive. As though he didn't know her anymore. "Kazi, it's okay," Emma said, taking a tentative step forward. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." The growl deepened, vibrating through the air. The sound was so raw, so primal, it was almost as if he was trying to push her away. But Emma didn't move. She couldn't. The bond they had shared for years, all the time they spent together, was not something that could be so easily undone. She couldn't let that go, no matter how much he seemed to be rejecting her. Kazi, Emma said again, her voice steady. She tried to keep the tremor from her words, but she could feel the heat rising in her chest, the anxiety that she had fought so hard to control. Please, remember me. I'm here for you. I raised you. You know me. Kazi halted a few feet in front of her. His breath was coming in sharp bursts, his chest heaving. He didn't respond. His dark eyes scanned her face, his gaze searching for something. But what was he looking for? Was it a sign of recognition? A hint of familiarity? Or had too much time passed? Was it too late? Emma tried to take another step, but as she did, Kazi suddenly roared. The sound was deafening. Emma's stomach dropped. The force of the roar felt like it rattled the very air around them. It wasn't a cry of anger, it was something else. Fear. Frustration. But most of all, it was a warning. Emma stumbled back instinctively, her pulse racing. She felt the ground beneath her shift as she tried to maintain her balance. Kazi's roar echoed through the jungle, causing birds to scatter into the trees. Kazi, please. Emma cried, her voice desperate. It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. You're not alone. You never were. But the gorilla's eyes narrowed, and with one swift movement, he lunged forward. The force of his movement was so sudden, so powerful, that Emma barely had time to react. She fell backward, the ground scraping against her hands, as Kazi's massive hands reached for her. Emma gasped, her heart in her throat, but just before Kazi could reach her, he stopped. He froze. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved. Emma's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of confusion and fear. What had just happened? Why had he stopped? Was it a moment of recognition? Was he holding back? Or was it something else entirely? Kazi's massive chest rose and fell as he stood over her, watching her with those deep, unreadable eyes. The tension in the air was thick, as if the slightest movement from either of them could set him off again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kazi stepped back. His massive frame loomed in front of her, but he was no longer charging. Instead, he stood there, still and silent, watching her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Emma slowly pushed herself up, wiping the dirt from her palms, but she didn't take her eyes off of him. She didn't dare. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she watched him, trying to make sense of everything. What had just happened? Why had Kazi stopped when he had the chance to strike? Did he still recognize her, even after all this time? Kazi, Emma said softly, her voice trembling. Please, I need you to trust me again. I'm still here. I never left. For a long time, nothing changed. Kazi simply stood there, his enormous presence filling the space between them. Emma's heart ached as she realized that, for all her efforts, she might not be able to reach him. She had hoped that the bond they shared would transcend the years, that the connection they had forged in those early days would bring him back to her, but now, she wasn't so sure. And then, just as Emma was beginning to doubt, Kazi took a small, cautious step toward her. His large eyes stayed locked on hers. He didn't growl. He didn't lunge. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma allowed herself to hope. But just as quickly, Kazi stopped. He turned his head sharply, as if something had caught his attention. Emma's heart dropped in her chest. Was he leaving? Was this it? Kazi moved back toward the shadows, his large form disappearing behind the trees, leaving Emma standing there, heartbroken and uncertain of what would happen next. Emma stood frozen for a moment, her body tense as she watched Kazi through the dense jungle. The enormous silverback's frame loomed in the distance, but he didn't move. It was as if the very air around them was holding its breath, waiting. The last time she had seen Kazi, he had been a young, playful gorilla, full of energy and curious about the world around him. But now, years later, the bond that had once been so strong seemed fragile, perhaps even broken. Her heart ached as she remembered the days when he had followed her everywhere, trusting her completely. Could that same trust still exist? Kazi? Emma whispered softly, her voice barely above a breath. She didn't dare to raise it too much. She had no idea how he might react to her presence now. The jungle around her seemed to go silent, as if it too was waiting for Kazi's next move. The tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the distant calls of birds and monkeys seemed to fade into the background. For a moment, there was no response. Kazi stood there, his dark eyes locked on her, and Emma couldn't help but feel a wave of uncertainty wash over her. He was so still, so silent. The gorilla that she had raised, the one she had nursed back to health, had always been expressive, always willing to engage with her. But now, his gaze was almost unreadable. Emma's heart pounded as the weight of their reunion began to sink in. Was he angry with her? Did he feel abandoned? She took a small step forward, hoping the movement wouldn't startle him. She had been warned about this moment, told not to meet Kazi, that it was too dangerous, that he had changed. Her colleagues in the wildlife reserve had all cautioned against it, saying that he had grown unpredictable, aggressive even. But Emma had ignored the warnings. She needed to see him, to understand what had happened to the animal she had once cared for so deeply. Kazi, it's me, Emma said, her voice shaking ever so slightly, but she pushed through it. It's Emma. Do you remember me? Kazi's expression shifted slightly, his brow furrowing, but he didn't make a sound. Emma's heart sank. She could feel the years of distance between them, the gulf that had grown between the gentle, playful gorilla she once knew and the creature now standing before her. She took another step forward, this time with more confidence, her eyes never leaving his. She remembered how he used to respond when she called his name, how his whole body would light up with recognition, with love. But now he seemed distant. Kazi, she took another step. It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. I've come to see you. The air around them was thick with tension. Kazi's deep, dark eyes were still locked on her, but his body remained motionless. He wasn't retreating, but he wasn't advancing either. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the soft rustling of the trees and the distant sound of animal calls. Emma could feel her chest tighten as she reached out slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she extended it toward him, palm open, a gesture of peace. She had done this hundreds of times before when Kazi had been a baby, reaching out to him in the same way, knowing that if he felt her touch, he would know he was safe. But this time, she wasn't sure what would happen. Kazi's gaze shifted to her hand, and for a moment, Emma thought he might approach. She held her breath, praying that he would recognize her, that their connection, however faint, still existed. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, that brief flicker of interest vanished. Kazi's eyes hardened, and his posture shifted, his chest expanding as if preparing for something. Emma took a step back, sensing that something was changing. Kazi, please, Emma whispered, her voice full of emotion. I've missed you. Please, come here. But instead of moving closer, Kazi let out a low grunt, a sound deep from his chest, almost a growl. Emma's breath caught in her throat. That sound, so unfamiliar and raw, sent a wave of fear through her. The Kazi she had known would never make such a noise unless something was wrong, unless he was frightened, confused, or angry. She instinctively took another step back, her hand dropping to her side. Kazi's eyes narrowed, and in an instant, Emma's body went on high alert. His whole demeanor shifted. He stood tall, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his thick coat of fur. His hands, once gentle and playful, were now balled into fists, and his lips curled slightly, revealing the sharpness of his teeth. The growl came again, louder this time, filling the air with an unmistakable warning. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to assess the situation. Was he about to attack? Kazi, no, she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. She wanted to reach out, to call him back to the side of the woman who had once raised him, but she could see the confusion and fear in his eyes. He wasn't the same animal. He wasn't the same gentle creature who had once trusted her completely. Something had changed. Maybe it had been the years apart, or the harshness of life in the wild. Maybe he had grown to see her as a stranger. But whatever it was, the Kazi standing before her now was not the gorilla she had known. The growl grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the ground. Emma froze. The space between them seemed to shrink, the distance growing more dangerous with each passing second. She knew she had to move carefully, knew that one wrong move could escalate the situation. Kazi was huge, far stronger than her, and his rage was building with each passing second. But then, as suddenly as the tension had built, Kazi stopped. His growl softened, his body relaxing just a little. Emma's heart raced as she stood there, waiting. She didn't know if this was a sign that he might calm down, or if it was a trick. Was he just biding his time? Could he remember her? Could he still trust her? Taking a slow, careful step forward, Emma spoke again. Kazi, it's me, Emma. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help you. Kazi blinked, his dark eyes searching her face, but there was still wariness in his gaze. He looked down at her extended hand, then back up at her face, his nostrils flaring with each breath. Emma slowly extended her hand again, but this time, she didn't push it too far. She kept her palm open and her movements slow, steady. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her nerves tight, but she had to keep her calm. This was Kazi. She had raised him, and she had to trust that he would remember her, that he would come back to her, even if it took time. Kazi's eyes flicked from her face to her hand, and then, incredibly, he took a step forward. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Was it possible? Could he be coming back to her? For a moment, the tension hung in the air, and then Kazi did something that Emma had never expected. He sniffed her hand. His massive nose hovered just above her palm, and Emma stood still, heart pounding in her chest. The air around them was thick with anticipation. Kazi didn't move for what felt like an eternity, but then, slowly, he extended his hand, one huge finger gently touching her palm. Emma let out a quiet breath of relief, but the moment was short-lived. Before she could react, Kazi pulled his hand back and let out a deep grunt. The moment of connection had been fleeting, and now Emma wasn't sure if it had been enough to break through the wall of confusion and anger that had built up over the years. Kazi stepped back, his body tense once again, and Emma knew that this wasn't over. He hadn't fully accepted her, and she couldn't be sure what would happen next. She had hoped that this moment would be the one where they rekindled their bond, but she could see that Kazi was still struggling with something inside him, something she didn't fully understand. As Emma slowly backed away, she felt a knot of frustration in her chest. The gorilla she had known, the one who had trusted her, who had followed her and looked to her for comfort, was gone. In his place stood a creature who was conflicted, confused, and perhaps even angry at her for abandoning him. The emotional toll of it all hit her like a wave, and she fought to keep herself together. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of a difficult journey to rebuild what had been lost. She had to believe that she could still reach Kazi, that the connection they once shared wasn't entirely gone. It would take time, but she wasn't going to give up on him. Kazi watched her retreat with his sharp gaze, his body still tense, and Emma took a deep breath. She would be back tomorrow. And the next day. And the next. She would keep coming until he remembered her, until they could find their way back to each other. For now, though, all she could do was hope. Emma's heart raced as she lay on the ground, the weight of Kazi's powerful body on top of her. The ground beneath her trembled from the force of his sudden lunge, his massive frame pinning her down. His hot breath was heavy on her face, and his thick fingers dug into the dirt beside her head, nearly brushing her hair. His growl rumbled through the air, low and menacing, as he loomed above her, staring down with eyes that seemed to burn with anger and confusion. Emma's mind raced. This wasn't the Kazi she remembered, the playful, curious gorilla who had once followed her around the compound as a baby, the one she had nurtured and raised from the moment she found him abandoned. The bond they shared had been built over years of gentle care, trust, and affection. And yet, here he was, now an adult, towering over her with a terrifying fierceness that left her breathless. "Kazi," she whispered, her voice trembling, but steady with the quiet command she had always used to speak to him. She didn't want to startle him. "It's me. It's Emma. I'm not going to hurt you." But Kazi didn't react. His eyes, once filled with innocence and trust, now seemed clouded with a storm of confusion and fear. His posture was stiff, his chest rising and falling with deep, labored breaths. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. He was on edge, every muscle in his body tense as though he were preparing to lash out at any moment. Emma could see the war in his eyes, the struggle between the familiar bond they once shared and the overwhelming instinct to defend himself, to push away anything or anyone that threatened him. The growl reverberated in the air again, louder this time, as if Kazi was warning her. He shifted his weight slightly, still towering above her, but his massive hands remained poised, ready to strike. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen under his watchful gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, not exactly, but something deeper, something primal, had overtaken the gorilla she once knew. "Kazi, please," Emma pleaded, reaching her hand out toward him cautiously, as she had done so many times before when he was just a baby, trying to calm him after he had been frightened or upset. "Please, it's me. Don't you remember? You're safe now. You're not alone." For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a flash of the baby gorilla who had looked up at her with trust and affection, the gorilla who had grown with her, always by her side. But then that moment was gone. Kazi's eyes shifted again, and the growl deepened, vibrating through Emma's very bones. He wasn't listening to her. The connection they once shared seemed to have evaporated, swallowed by the confusion and fear he was experiencing now. She could see the strain in his eyes, the way his powerful body quivered. The gorilla was still a wild animal, despite the years of interaction they had shared. His instincts were taking over, and the humanity, the connection between them, was slipping away, lost in the chaos of the moment. Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry, and she had to fight the panic rising within her chest. "Please, Kazi," she whispered again, her voice soft but unwavering. She had to reach him. She had to remind him of who she was, of who they were to each other. "Remember me. Remember us." But as she extended her hand, Kazi stepped back slightly, his eyes narrowing, his head tilting slightly to the side as though he were trying to make sense of her presence. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't leaving. He was uncertain, confused, but still standing tall, a hulking figure in front of her, intimidating and powerful. The moment felt frozen in time, every second dragging on, every breath she took filled with fear, but also hope. Then, unexpectedly, Kazi roared. The sound was deafening, and the shockwave of it reverberated through the ground beneath Emma. Her ears rang, and for a moment, she couldn't hear anything but the pounding in her head. Her body went rigid as Kazi's roar echoed through the dense jungle, a primal, raw noise that shook her to her core. Emma flinched, but she didn't look away from him. She refused to show fear, even though her pulse was racing. The roar was filled with frustration, with confusion, and Emma knew that it wasn't directed at her, not entirely. Kazi was struggling with something deep inside of him. Something had changed in him since they were last together. Something in his past, something about the trauma he had experienced, was eating away at the animal she had once known. "Kazi, stop," she whispered, trying to speak over the ringing in her ears. Her voice barely above a breath. "Please. I'm here. You know me." But instead of calming, Kazi began to pound his chest. The sound of his fist striking his broad, muscular chest reverberated through the air, and Emma could feel it in the pit of her stomach. He was growing agitated, more erratic. His movements were uncoordinated, fueled by a primal instinct to assert dominance and protect himself. She could see that he wasn't the gorilla she remembered. Something had changed in him, something beyond her control, beyond the trust they once shared. Kazi's behavior was unpredictable, dangerous. Emma knew she had to be careful. She couldn't risk making him more aggressive, but she couldn't back down either. She had to remind him of their connection, of the years they spent together. She had to reach him, even if it meant putting herself in harm's way. Kazi, please, Emma said again, her voice shaking now as she struggled to hold back her fear. I know you're confused. I know you're scared. But you don't have to be. For a moment, Kazi paused, his chest still rising and falling with deep, labored breaths. He seemed to hesitate, his sharp eyes never leaving Emma's. Then, with a sudden, unexpected motion, he took a step back. Emma froze, unsure of what was happening, unsure if he was going to retreat or if he was preparing for another lunge. But instead of lunging, Kazi stepped back completely, lowering his head and turning to the side. He moved away from Emma, but his body language was still tense, still filled with the remnants of fear and uncertainty. Emma felt her chest tighten as she watched him move further away. She couldn't let him go like this, not when they were so close, not when he was still conflicted. She couldn't lose him again. Kazi turned his back to her, still holding his powerful form. He was uncertain, but not fully hostile. It was a small, fragile victory for Emma, one she wasn't sure how long would last. She had to be careful now. She had to keep talking to him, keep reminding him of who he was, of who they were together. Please, Kazi, Emma whispered, taking a tentative step forward. Her voice wavered, but she didn't care. I'm not going to leave you. You're not alone. She moved closer to him, her eyes never leaving his large, watchful figure. She knew that one wrong move could trigger another outburst, but she couldn't stop now. She had to try. Emma knelt down, keeping her posture non-threatening, her hands open in front of her. Her heart was pounding, but she held her breath, hoping that Kazi would respond to her. She remembered all the times they had shared moments like this before, quiet moments of trust, when they would sit together and she would offer him the reassurance he needed. Those memories flooded her mind, making her desperate to bridge the gap between them once again. Kazi didn't move at first. He simply stood there, his eyes focused on her, watching every small movement she made. His posture was still tense, but the anger was gone, replaced by something quieter, more cautious. Emma didn't know if it was enough, if she had done enough to calm him, but she knew she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when she was so close. Slowly, carefully, she reached her hand out again. This time, Kazi didn't move away. Instead, he shifted slightly, his gaze following her hand. Emma held her breath as she waited, every muscle in her body tensed, unsure of what he would do. Would he take her hand? Would he recoil? Or would he finally let her back into his world? Kazi's body was still, but his eyes softened, just slightly. Then, without any warning, he lowered his head and extended his own large, calloused hand, reaching out toward her. In that moment, Emma felt an overwhelming surge of relief. It wasn't over, not yet, but the connection between them had been restored, even if just for a brief moment. Emma smiled, her heart lightening, and as their hands finally met, she whispered, I knew you'd remember. The air in the jumble felt thick with tension. Emma stood still, her chest tight, watching Kazi from a distance. His massive form loomed in the clearing, his dark eyes locked on hers. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken question in his stare, Do you remember me? Kazi's deep, rumbling growl reverberated through the trees, the sound echoing through the quiet forest. It was a warning. A clear signal that he wasn't sure about this, wasn't sure about her. He had changed in the years since they'd last been together. He had grown stronger, more unpredictable. But Emma knew Kazi. She had raised him from a tiny, scared baby gorilla, and through all their years together, she had never stopped believing that the bond they shared was unbreakable. But now, as she stood on the edge of his enclosure, watching him carefully, she wasn't so sure. Kazi, Emma whispered, her voice cracking slightly. She couldn't help it. The emotion of seeing him again, the gorilla she had poured her heart into, was overwhelming. How had it come to this? How had the sweet, gentle gorilla she had raised become this powerful, intimidating creature? She took a deep breath and stepped forward, slowly. Kazi's eyes followed her every movement. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Emma felt as though time had frozen. She tried to steady her breathing, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. Her hands trembled at her sides as she recalled the old days when Kazi had trusted her completely. Back then, he had been so small, so innocent. He had relied on her for everything, from food to comfort, and even just the simple joy of playing together. They had shared everything. She had taught him the ways of the world, and he had taught her patience and trust. But that was before everything changed. Emma had left the wildlife reserve for a while, just a few months, but it was enough. During that time, Kazi had been moved to a new, larger enclosure. The reserve had grown, the staff had changed, and Kazi had been treated more like a wild animal. Emma had heard about the transition, but she hadn't realized how much it had affected him until now. "Kazi, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to spook him. She didn't want him to run away. "It's me. Emma. Remember?" Kazi's eyes narrowed, his body tense. His large hands flexed, his knuckles visible under his dark fur. He didn't move closer, but neither did he retreat. Emma could see the confusion in his eyes, the wariness. He didn't recognize her, not fully, anyway. The years had taken their toll. The gentle nature he had once displayed toward her seemed distant, replaced by the instincts of a gorilla forced to survive in the jungle, surrounded by constant challenges. Emma couldn't help but wonder if she had been gone too long. Had the time apart broken their connection forever? She continued moving forward slowly, taking careful steps, her hand still by her side. She wasn't sure if he would remember her, but she had to try. She had to show him that she hadn't abandoned him. "Please," she repeated. "Please, Kazi. I'm not going to hurt you." The growl rumbled from deep within his chest again. It was softer this time, more like a low warning. Emma froze, but she didn't step back. If she ran now, she would prove to Kazi that she didn't trust him either. Instead, she took another deep breath and spoke again, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I raised you. I gave you a home. We were family." Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing like thunder in the stillness of the jungle. She knew this was risky. She knew that she might be pushing him too far. But she couldn't leave him like this, not after everything they had been through together. Kazi moved, taking a step toward her. Emma's breath caught in her throat. His eyes were fixed on hers, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in them. It was like a shadow of the gorilla she had raised, a glimmer of the playful, trusting Kazi who had once crawled into her lap for comfort. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Instead, Kazi stopped a few feet away from her, standing tall and proud. He grunted, a noise that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. The strength in his voice was unmistakable, and Emma could feel her legs shaking as she stood there, facing him. "Please," she said again, but this time her voice was firmer, more resolute. "I know you remember me. I know you're still in there." For a long moment, there was silence. Emma's hands clenched into fists, but she kept her posture open, her body relaxed, trying to communicate that she wasn't a threat. She had to stay calm, she had to show him that she wasn't scared, that she wasn't going to back down. Kazi watched her for what felt like an eternity. His deep breaths filled the space between them, his massive chest rising and falling. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Emma could feel it, the sense of something about to snap, something hanging by a thread. Then, unexpectedly, Kazi moved again, but this time, he didn't charge at her. Instead, he lowered his head slowly, bringing his enormous face closer to the ground. His nostrils flared as he sniffed the air around her. Emma held her breath, not daring to move. She didn't want to disturb the moment. Could this be the beginning of their connection again? Kazi's deep, heavy breathing filled the silence. Emma remained motionless, waiting, hoping. Finally, Kazi stood back up and looked at her with an expression that was almost unreadable. Then, with one powerful movement, Kazi reached out with one of his massive hands. Emma's heart skipped a beat as the hand hovered in the air just inches from her face. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She had raised him to trust her, and now she had to trust him. The huge hand, so much larger than her own, gently brushed her cheek. It was as if Kazi was testing her, seeing if she was the same person he remembered. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the roughness of his skin against hers, the familiarity of the touch. Kazi's hand lingered for a moment longer before he slowly withdrew, his expression softening ever so slightly. His body language, which had been so rigid before, seemed to relax. But Emma didn't let her guard down yet. She knew Kazi, knew that any sudden movement could set him off again. With his large eyes fixed on her, Kazi took another step back. This time, Emma didn't move. She let him go at his own pace. She had to give him space, let him decide. "I'm here, Kazi," she said quietly, watching him carefully. "I'm not leaving you. We're still family." For a long time, there was no response. Kazi stood there, watching her with what seemed like a mix of confusion, curiosity, and something else, something deeper that Emma couldn't quite place. Finally, Kazi let out a deep sigh, a sound that almost seemed like relief. He turned his back to her and began to move slowly toward the far side of the enclosure. Emma's heart sank. Was he done with her? Had she ruined everything by pushing him too far? But then, as he reached the edge of the clearing, Kazi paused. He turned back around and looked at her once more, his dark eyes meeting hers. In that moment, Emma knew. She had done it. She had broken through. The gorilla she had raised, the one she had loved, was still in there, buried beneath the layers of fear and survival instincts. And now, they had a chance. They could rebuild what they had lost. Kazi gave a final, soft grunt, a sound that Emma recognized as one of acknowledgement. She couldn't believe it. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't a threat, it was an understanding. Emma allowed herself to smile. Slowly, she nodded. "Thank you, Kazi," she whispered. "I knew you were still in there. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell." And for the first time in years, the jungle felt quiet, peaceful, even hopeful. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm about to break. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and her breath was shallow as she slowly backed away from Kazi, her eyes never leaving his. He stood there, towering over her, his massive chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. His deep growl vibrated through the ground beneath her, and Emma could feel every inch of his fury. She had never seen him like this before. Kazi, the gorilla she had raised since infancy, was not the same animal standing before her. His eyes, once filled with the innocence of a young orphan, were now clouded with something else: anger, fear, confusion. She had been warned by her colleagues that it might happen, that time away from her, from the care she had provided him, might turn Kazi into something unrecognizable. But nothing could have prepared Emma for the primal force that stood before her now. "Please, Kazi," Emma whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and love. She had spent years raising him, teaching him to trust her, to learn from her. She had never once doubted that their bond was unbreakable. But now, she wasn't so sure. Kazi's deep growl rumbled in his chest again. He wasn't responding to her words, but to the fear in her voice. He could sense her fear, and that only seemed to drive him further into the wild, untamed instincts that had been buried for so long. Emma stood still, her body trembling but her mind working furiously. She had to think of something, anything, that would get through to him. There was no tranquilizer gun, no backup. This was all on her. She was the only one who could bring Kazi back, but how? "Kazi, I'm here," she said softly, her hands raised in a gesture of calm, trying to reassure him. "I'm here to help you, I'm not here to hurt you." The gorilla took a step closer, his large feet thumping against the earth with every movement. His eyes were fixed on her, but there was a flicker of uncertainty there. Emma could see it. He was still the same gorilla she had raised, the one who had followed her everywhere, the one who had trusted her unconditionally. But now, the gap between them was wide. He was confused, lost, and angry. And Emma wasn't sure what had caused this shift. Had it been too long? Had the years of separation been too much for him? Emma reached out cautiously, one hand extended toward Kazi. Her fingers were trembling, but she fought to keep her composure. She had to show him that she wasn't a threat. She had to show him that they still had that connection, that she could be a safe place again. Kazi stopped in his tracks, his massive form standing rigid. He seemed to be assessing her, trying to make sense of the situation. The growl that had been building in his chest faltered, and for a brief moment, Emma dared to hope that there was a part of him still willing to listen. "Kazi," she whispered again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "You know me. You know who I am. Please, don't do this." The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Kazi's gaze never left her, his chest heaving with every breath he took. Emma took a slow, steadying breath of her own, trying to remain calm, to show him that she wasn't afraid, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. And then, just as Emma was about to take another step, something changed. Kazi's posture softened. The growl dissipated, and his eyes no longer burned with rage. He stood there, watching her, his body trembling slightly, as if he were caught between two worlds. Emma didn't dare move. She stayed perfectly still, praying that this wasn't just a brief moment of hesitation. She had to make this work. It was then that Kazi took another step toward her. This time, much slower, more cautious. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively took a half step forward. But she didn't want to push him. She couldn't afford to make him feel threatened again. "Kazi, it's okay," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone." Another step. This time, Kazi's eyes softened, and Emma could see the faintest flicker of recognition in them. He stopped just in front of her, his massive frame towering over her, but he wasn't growling anymore. He wasn't lunging. He was still, silent, watching her, like he was trying to figure out who she was now. Who he was in relation to her. Emma's heart raced, but she didn't move. She could see the fear in his eyes, and she knew it was because he didn't know what to make of her presence. After all these years, the trust they once shared was strained. Could it ever be restored? Her fingers brushed against his thick, matted fur, and Kazi flinched, pulling back slightly. But Emma didn't withdraw. She let her hand rest on his fur, just for a moment. She was showing him that she wasn't going to hurt him. She wasn't a threat. "Please, Kazi," she said, her voice full of emotion now. "Please remember me. We've been through so much together. I need you to trust me." The gorilla let out a low grunt, and Emma thought for a moment that he might pull away again, but he didn't. Instead, he slowly lowered his head, his enormous brow furrowing as though he was trying to understand what she was saying. His massive hands, usually so strong and forceful, were now still. He was hesitant, cautious, but not aggressive. Emma had a fleeting moment of hope. "That's it," she said softly, keeping her voice steady. "You're safe with me." Kazi's eyes softened again, the fierce tension in his body beginning to relax, ever so slightly. His nostrils flared, and Emma could see that he was fighting something deep inside him that made him fearful. But despite that fear, he was still there, still standing before her. And that was enough. Emma felt a surge of determination rise within her. She couldn't lose him now. She wouldn't. Kazi had been through so much. He had lost his family, his home, and his trust in the world. He had been forced to survive on his own for years, and now, Emma was all he had left. As she continued to speak softly to him, Emma reached up with both hands, cautiously touching his arm. Kazi tensed for a moment, but then, his body seemed to relax again. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned down, his face coming closer to hers. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Emma held her breath, waiting, praying that this moment would last. And then, Kazi did something she hadn't expected. He gently pressed his forehead against hers. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. It was a sign that he remembered her. That their bond was still there, beneath all the years, the fear, and the pain. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she gently stroked his fur. "I'm here, Kazi. I'm not going anywhere." Kazi stayed like that for a long moment, his massive body still, but his presence calming. Emma's heart swelled with love for him, and in that instant, she knew that she had done it. She had reached him. He had remembered her. But the calm didn't last long. Suddenly, Kazi pulled back, and Emma felt the shift again. His eyes grew wide with uncertainty, and he stepped back, his posture tense. It was as if he had remembered something that had made him retreat before. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. Had she pushed too far? Was this it? But before she could react, Kazi's gaze softened again, and he slowly returned to her side. This time, his movements were slower, more deliberate. He sat down, his massive frame settling on the ground as he looked up at her, a strange mix of fear and affection in his eyes. Emma let out a slow breath, her hands trembling. She had made it through the storm. The connection was there, fragile but real. "I'm here, Kazi," she whispered again, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here." The tension in the air was thick, heavier than the humid jungle air surrounding Emma. She stood frozen, watching Kazi as he took another cautious step forward. Her heart pounded against her chest, and every instinct screamed at her to be careful, to stay still, not to make any sudden movements. But she couldn't stop herself, she had to try. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when Kazi, the gorilla she raised, might remember her. Kazi's eyes were focused on her, but they were different now. The fierce aggression she'd seen earlier was gone, replaced by a strange wariness, like he was unsure of what he was feeling. His massive body was still tense, and his muscles rippled beneath his thick coat of fur, but his posture was no longer aggressive. He was still the gorilla she knew, but something had changed. Emma had to remind herself that this wasn't the same Kazi she had raised from a baby. This was a grown, wild animal who had spent years away from her, living a life without the safety and trust they once shared. She couldn't expect him to just return to the way things were. She slowly, carefully, stretched out her hand, palm open, in a gesture she had used countless times before to show him she wasn't a threat. Emma knew Kazi well enough to understand the small shifts in his body language. She could tell that he was hesitating, evaluating her movements, unsure of whether he could trust her. She had to be patient, had to give him time. "Kazi," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She couldn't help the emotion in her tone. She had raised him from a tiny, vulnerable baby gorilla, fed him, trained him, and spent every day with him. In a way, he was her child, and now, after all these years, he was here, standing in front of her. She couldn't give up now. "It's me, Emma. I'm not going to hurt you." Kazi's deep, brown eyes flickered, almost as if he was processing her words. He looked at her hand, then back at her face. His gaze was intense, but there was something in his eyes, something familiar. It wasn't the same look of wildness he'd had earlier. It wasn't the same angry, confused stare that had nearly broken her. This was different. This was Kazi, the gorilla she knew, the one who had once sat beside her and gently rested his head in her lap as she sang to him. But even though the flicker of recognition was there, Kazi still stood back, wariness dancing in his eyes. He was unsure, hesitant. His muscles still taut, his chest heaving with each breath. Emma felt the old fear stirring deep in her chest. It had been years since she'd seen him like this, so close, yet so distant. Would he remember her? Would he trust her? The last thing she wanted was for their reunion to be a tragic failure. She needed Kazi to know she was there to help him, that nothing had changed between them. Another moment passed, and then, as if making a decision, Kazi took another step toward her. This time, Emma didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply held her breath, praying that this moment wasn't an illusion, that Kazi wasn't just toying with her emotions. She could see his muscles rippling with each step he took. The powerful form moving slowly toward her. His gaze remained on her, his deep brown eyes never leaving her face. He was watching her with a new kind of curiosity, his previous aggression fading, replaced by something else, something softer, but still laced with uncertainty. Then, without warning, Kazi stopped. He was close now, just a few feet away. Emma could see every detail of his face, the deep lines of age, the wrinkles around his eyes, the gray fur creeping at his temples. His body had grown massive since the days when she had cradled him in her arms. Kazi had become an imposing figure, untamed and free, a king of the jungle, not the helpless baby she had once known. Kazi's head tilted slightly, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. He was studying her, as if trying to piece together the fragments of their past. For a long moment, they stood there, locked in a silent exchange. Emma's hand was still stretched out in front of her, but now, the distance between them felt both impossibly small and impossibly vast. She was so close to him, yet she knew the gulf between them, created by years of separation, of living in different worlds, was wider than any physical space could measure. Emma's voice trembled as she spoke again, but this time, her words were more firm, more certain. "Kazi," she said softly, "I'm not going anywhere. I'll never leave you. Please remember me." She wasn't sure if he understood the depth of her words, but something in her heart told her that he did. He looked down at her hand again, and for the briefest moment, Emma thought she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, his gaze softening just a little. He reached out his own hand, his fingers huge and powerful, but with a gentle precision that surprised her. The world seemed to hold its breath as Kazi's hand moved toward hers, his large fingers almost caressing her outstretched palm. Emma's heart raced as she slowly, cautiously, touched his hand. It was warm, strong, and it sent a surge of emotion through her. This was Kazi. He remembered her. There was no mistaking it. But just as Emma felt the immense weight of relief settling over her, Kazi pulled back abruptly. His body stiffened, and his eyes darted to the side, his expression flickering with uncertainty once again. Emma froze. What had just happened? Was she mistaken? Had she misread his signals? The moment stretched out, thick with unspoken words. Emma couldn't make sense of it. Kazi had been so close. They had been so close. He had touched her, but now he was pulling away. Her heart sank. Had the distance between them become too much to overcome? Had the years of separation created a chasm that even their bond couldn't bridge? For a few seconds, Emma stood there, her heart heavy in her chest. She could feel the old sense of loss creeping in, the feeling of abandonment, of the bond she had once shared with Kazi slipping away again. But before she could speak, before she could even react, Kazi's eyes snapped back to her. This time, there was something different in his expression. The fear, the anger, the confusion, it was all still there, but there was something else, something that resembled acceptance. Kazi took another step forward, slower this time. His movements were deliberate, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't growl. He didn't roar. He didn't retreat. He was simply moving toward her, inch by inch, until finally, he was close enough that Emma could feel the heat from his massive body. He was still a giant, still a creature that could crush her in seconds if he wanted to. But the tension in his body had lessened. His steps were more relaxed, his gaze softer. Emma's heart leaped into her throat. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when Kazi truly recognized her. She could feel it deep in her bones. She reached out her hand once more, but this time, she didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for Kazi to decide. She knew now that he had to trust her, that he had to know that she would never hurt him. She stretched her fingers toward him, slowly, steadily, and this time, Kazi didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out again, his large, powerful hand touching hers gently, but with an unmistakable familiarity. Emma's breath caught in her chest as she felt the warmth of his hand against hers. It was like nothing had changed. The years, the pain, the distance, it all melted away in that one, quiet moment. Kazi's eyes softened, and Emma could see something flicker in his gaze, a recognition, a memory of the bond they had shared. There was no growl, no roar, no fear. Just a soft, unspoken understanding that neither time nor distance could erase. "I'm here," Emma whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'll never leave you." And this time, when Kazi gently pulled her hand toward him, she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, pressing her hand against his enormous chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath the thick fur. Kazi's enormous body rumbled softly, almost like a purr, as he lowered his head toward her. Emma closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that they could find their way back to each other. There were no words between them. No grand gestures. Just the quiet, profound understanding that after everything, they had found each other once more. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.